Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to talk about the dire humanitarian situation in Puerto Rico and to challenge this country to end a century of discrimination against the Puerto Rican people. While the fleeting media attention may have waned, the desperation of the people of Puerto Rico has not. The lackluster response from the Trump administration, it's an outrage. It's been more than a month since the hurricane, and still 80% of the island's electricity is still out. Roads and bridges have collapsed. Homes have been destroyed. Of the 67 hospitals that are open, less than half of them are operating with electricity. Families are searching far and wide for clean drinking water. Some have been drinking water from wells at a Superfund site. Now, this kind of inhumane response, it would never, ever be permitted in a U.S. state. But one doesn't even have to look at other states to evaluate this response. We can look abroad. Within 2 weeks of the earthquake in Haiti, there were 17,000 U.S. military personnel on the ground in that country. 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria made landfall in the United States had deployed only 10,000 troops to respond to the disaster in both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. News broke yesterday that the state-owned electric company on the island, PREPA, refused to operationalize mutual aid agreements with electric companies on the U.S. mainland. That's a standard step in normal disaster response. Now, fault lies with PREPA, but how on earth did FEMA and the Trump administration allow for that to happen, leaving millions of Puerto Ricans in the dark and in danger for almost a month? It's beyond comprehension, and it speaks to the failure of the U.S. government response. But, Madam President, the truth is that Hurricane Maria exposed far more than just immediate physical damage. The hurricane also laid bare a very simple truth that is plain to every resident of the island and every Puerto Rican living in my state. The truth is this: the United States has been screwing Puerto Rico for over 100 years, and this is just the latest, most disgusting chapter. There is an undercurrent in the discourse about Puerto Rico that is as pernicious as it is ahistorical. You'll hear people like President Trump say that Puerto Ricans are wholly responsible for the financial mess that they find themselves in, and Puerto Rico should just pull itself up by its bootstraps. The rewriting of history ignores the fact that the federal government and Congress, we've had our hands tightly wrapped around those very bootstraps since 1898. The United States acquired Puerto Rico from Spain through the Treaty of Paris in 1898, when the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. Puerto Ricans didn't ask to be part of the United States. We acquired the island. A century ago, Congress extended U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans, and in 1950, Congress recognized the island's limited authority over internal governance, and Puerto Rico became formally known as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. But being a Commonwealth or a territory is permanent second-class status. Without access to the same health care reimbursement, the same infrastructure funding, the same education dollars as other states, Puerto Rico starts every single race 50 feet behind the rest of America. These built-in disadvantages are designed to hold Puerto Rico back. They have been in place for 100 years to keep Puerto Rico from being a true economic competitor with the mainland. And believe me, the Puerto Rican people have done everything they can to overcome this discriminatory treatment. There is an entrepreneurial, never say die spirit in Puerto Rico. I know this because no state has a greater percentage of its residents with Puerto Rican roots than Connecticut. But despite the strength of the Puerto Rican people, they're stuck because Washington has tied their hands behind their backs by taking away the right to vote in federal elections, virtually guaranteeing Puerto Rico's economic disadvantage will never, ever be remedied. It's a black hole from which Puerto Rico and the other 4 U.S. territories can never escape. Now, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, despite the fact that recent polling suggests that like half of Americans don't know this. But they can't vote for president. They have no voting representation in Congress. Think about it this way. Americans with a mainland address can vote if they move to Mongolia or Sierra Leone. But if they temporarily take up residence in a U.S. territory like Puerto Rico, they miraculously lose their right to vote. And there are real practical consequences to this lack of representation. We're watching the most egregious example right now. Do you really think that if Puerto Rico had 2 United States senators, 80% of the island would still be without power a month after the hurricane? And by the way, Puerto Rico has more citizens than 21 states that have a total of 42 senators in this body. You think a president would denigrate and insult Puerto Rico the way that President Trump has if it had electoral votes? But the botched response to Maria is just the latest attack on the island, perpetuated by a Congress that can afford to ignore a big part of the United States that has no voice in Congress to object. For over 6 decades, the United States Navy pummeled the island of Vieques, just off Puerto Rico's coast, with ordnance, using it as a bombing range for military exercises. Those weapons allegedly contain uranium, napalm, and Agent Orange. Today, people who live on Vieques, they are 8 times more likely to have cardiovascular disease. They're 7 times more likely to die of diabetes than others in Puerto Rico. Cancer rates on Vieques are much higher. And if you want to know why Puerto Rico has been in a decade-long recession, look no further than Congress. More than 50 years ago, the U.S. government launched several initiatives to help spur economic growth on the island. It was a good thing. Ironically enough, the initiatives were collectively called Operation Bootstrap. One of the tools that was used to spur economic growth was a tax break to allow U.S. manufacturing companies to avoid corporate income taxes on profits that were made in Puerto Rico. Manufacturers descended on the island in droves, and the entire economy in Puerto Rico, it became oriented around those companies. But what Congress gives, Congress can take away, especially if the entity you're taking from has no meaningful representation in Congress. In 1996, Congress phased out the tax breaks, and guess what? It sucked the island's tax base away, cratering Puerto Rico's economy for the next 2 decades. Now, listen, it's worth noting that Puerto Rico is not blameless for the financial situation that it's in. There have definitely been a fair share of mismanagement on the island, bad decisions that have been made, saying that Puerto Rico is only a victim of schemes of the mainland. It's not true. But the same can be said of fiscal mismanagement and bad decisions in other U.S. states. But a century of underinvestment in Puerto Rico has been a big part of the story as to how they arrived at this situation. And unlike all those other U.S. states, Puerto Rico has no way of rectifying the past misdeeds because its toolbox to reckon with its past is limited to what Congress sticks in the toolbox. And that toolbox doesn't provide access to the bankruptcy code. So as a result, Congress passes PROMESA, which created this financial oversight board on the island. Puerto Rican bondholders on Wall Street, who bought the bonds for pennies on the dollar, are now challenging the current oversight and the board's legitimacy with the hope of being paid before the island gets relief. Now, these practices of the bondholders who have been circling the island for years, they are made more menacing because they are spending boatloads of money lobbying Congress. Just watch the TV at night here in Washington, D.C. to see their ads. They know that the people of Puerto Rico have no voice here, have no votes here. And now it looks like other predators are circling. News came out this week that a small 2-person company in Whitefish, Montana, somehow, some way, got a no-bid $300 million contract to restore power in Puerto Rico from the island's power authority. The same power authority that refused the help of experienced electric companies who actually know how to turn back on the power. So how does something like this happen? Well, it turns out that that little town in Montana is the home to the new Secretary of Interior. And get ready, because this isn't just the start. President Trump and his billionaire cronies are going to use this disaster to enrich themselves. The Whitefish Power contract given to a friend of the Secretary of Interior with 2 people employed at that company. It is just a scratch on the surface of what's to come. So Puerto Rico has been getting screwed for decades. None of this is new. None of it is unpredictable. And if you want to think that this is just one century-long string of rough luck, you're ignoring the last critical aspect of Puerto Rican history. Back in 1901, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided that though residents of the territories, they lived in the United States, they shouldn't be able to enjoy full constitutional protections, the Supreme Court was pretty explicit about why these citizens in places like Puerto Rico deserved this second-class treatment. Justice Henry Brown, who, by the way, authored the separate but equal doctrine, held that Puerto Rico and the other territories didn't need to be afforded full rights under the Constitution because the islands were, quote, inhabited by alien races differing from us in religion, customs, laws, methods of taxation, and modes of thought. That, my friends, is racism defined. And it is both past and present when it comes to the rationale for the historical and continued mistreatment of the people of Puerto Rico. It's time for that mistreatment to change. Not just by doing right by Puerto Rico at this moment, at their hour of need. Yes, it is time for President Trump to command that FEMA and the U.S. military and the powers that be in Puerto Rico turn back on the lights right now. Congress should give Puerto Rico every cent that they need, and I'm glad that we came together this week to approve the latest round of emergency aid. But it's long past time that we address the second-class treatment that we have given the people of Puerto Rico for decades. Even that racist 1901 Supreme Court decision contemplated that the territory's unequal status could only be justified temporarily. And so it's time to untie the hands of the Puerto Rican people and ensure that they have full economic and political rights. And I hope that my colleagues will join me in this conversation in the coming months. It is just as important as the one that we are having on emergency response. Because if anything good can come from the disaster of Hurricane Maria, maybe it's that. I yield the floor.